Good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming and welcome to the Vermont Archaeological Society's continued virtual presentation. I'm Nathan Allison, President of VAS, and we're very excited that you're joining us. Your membership and support help VAS continue its mission in bringing awareness to Vermont's past and efforts in protecting its rich cultural resources through events and programming like this evening's talk. So VAS would like to acknowledge that the land we're meeting on this evening has served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples for many thousands of years. Vermont is the ancestral homeland of the Mohican and Abenaki nations. Despite tremendous hardships, including the forceful relocation of the Stockbridge-Muncie community to Wisconsin, both nations maintain their tribal sovereignty and connection to the lands as stewards. We honor the resilience and strength of their ancestors, past and present, as we gather together. So we hope this evening's presentation provides an opportunity to reflect on that history and to work together toward a more just and inclusive society for all. So a few points of housekeeping before we get started. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and we'll make that available on our social media pages at a later time. We're going to ask everybody to please keep your microphones muted until after the presentation, and we will have a brief Q&A if you all have questions or comments for our speaker. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over to VAS Vice President Yvonne Benny-Bass to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Tonight we have Niels Rinehart, longtime VAS member and a friend of many of us. Niels received his master's degree in anthropology from the State University of New York at Binghamton, same place as myself, different times. He's worked extensively in cultural resource management archaeology, mostly in the Northeast, before finally fetching up here in our brave little state of Vermont. Niels did pursue a doctorate in anthropology at UMass, but thankfully came to his senses before he got in too deep. He currently works for the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation in the Lands Administration Division, where his responsibilities include managing archaeology projects on state lands, dealing with me, and managing A&R land records, licenses, and leases. He's also an NAI certified interpretive guide, as well as the journal editor for the Vermont Archaeological Society. He volunteers extensively with the Ethan Allen Museum, and in his spare time, he writes and likes to get outdoors whenever possible. He and his wife, Lauren, live in an old house in Jericho, and also it's also occasionally inhabited by their two boys, Abraham and Liam. Thank you, Niels.
Thank you, Yvonne. That was great. And let me see, let me try to share here. 1 second here. There we go. Good. All right, thank you. So yeah, so thanks so much for having me here today. This is a talk that I first gave as a paper to a session at the annual meeting for the Society for California Archaeology back in March. It was a session in community archaeology that was run by the California Archaeological Site Stewardship Program, CASIP. And then I gave another version of it at the annual meeting for the NAI here in Burlington back in April, and then I changed it up again for this. So, oh, I better hit my timer there. Great, thank you. So, anyway, so this here is a view of the Adirondacks, and what you see behind it is blue sky, which used to exist here. Hopefully, will again. But so I want to start with. Start at the back at the end of the 20th century when I first began as an archaeologist, and I worked as a shovel bum, field tech for several years, and then after finishing graduate school, I had a job as a project director in Pennsylvania. And I remember one of my first projects, we were working along the edge of a road, and this guy came up to us and he asked us, what are you doing? So I went ahead and I gave him this explanation, and I filled it with all of the big words I had just learned in graduate school. all the many isms and wasms and so on. And I thought that, that I gave a very good explanation for all the processes through time and how this site fit into all these great schemes and what it all meant and such. But this was sort of the reaction I got from him, and he just sort of, his eyes sort of glazed over, and he said thank you, and then he left. And I knew enough to know that I had lost him, that I had lost an opportunity there, and that I hadn't really said much that had stuck with him. So I thought, well, so the next time that this happens, that somebody comes by and asks me, well, what I'm doing, I figured I'd try to take out all those big words, all the long multi-syllabic words that I was so proud of. So I tried that, like the next time somebody came up. But what I found was that once I pulled out all those big words, I felt sort of like the emperor with no clothes. I didn't really feel like there was a lot there that I was actually saying. So the problem here is that I didn't really have a story. I wasn't telling a story. I thought that I was saying stuff. I was very interested in so on in it, but I didn't really have a story. So my talk here is to sort of to document what I've been trying to learn, which is how do I tell a story about the work that I do. So first off, what makes a good story? How does a good story work? And by good here, I mean how do I tell something that sticks with the audience? And then two, how can archaeologists tell good stories about the work that we do? And then finally, I wanted to talk about like why do I think that good storytelling is so important for archaeologists? And here I include, his historians and interpreters, tribal historians, and so on. Like why is it important that we tell good stories? So to start with, in archaeology, it's been my experience. We always like to divide things up into groups of three. We have early, middle, late, and then we might even divide those three things into further groups of three. And then we use diagnostic artifacts to assign. We then assign these artifacts to each of these three periods, and we use them as diagnostics to be able to tell whether or not it's early, middle, or late. But the problem here is that those periods are stagnant. They don't move, right? So how do we show movement between these periods? So what we do is we have processes. Here we have a list. Things become increasingly complex, or maybe there's increased specialization. We use these sorts of broad processes to create movement from one period to the next. And there's nothing wrong with this. I like a good process. I like a good explanation, so on. I enjoy this stuff. But the problem is that there's no people and there's no names and there's no anecdotes. There isn't any story here that will really stick with an audience. So how do I tell a good story? This meme here came up on my feed this past week. I guess that the internet knew I had this talk, and so here's how Tolstoy thought that you wrote a good story. Or maybe not, I don't know. Anyways, so I've taken a number of classes and, read books and so on. And like, as Yvonne was saying, like I took the course with the National Association for Interpretation to become a SIG, a Certified Interpretive Guide. And but throughout this coursework and so on, what I've learned is, there's this basic arc to a good story. You start somewhere and you go to this moment of truth, and then it leads to a new normal. So you go from A to B to C, and you have this arc. The dramatic arc. And that's what makes a good story. In this past fall, I took a class with an interpreter named Kristen Robinson, and she told us about the Pixar story path. Now, I have kids who grew up in the 2000s and the 2010s, so I've seen a lot of Pixar films, a lot of them, but I didn't know that they all fall into this 7-step pattern. They all work according to this path. So as an assignment, Kristen had us go and take a story from our own work, like some site or something like that, and tell that story within the Pixar story path. So I went and used the story I'd heard about the old schoolhouse at Little River State Park. This is a state park that's run by FPR in Waterbury, and it's actually the park encompasses this old town from the 19th century that's now all abandoned, and there's a lot of cellar holes there and old stone walls and so on. There's also the foundations to this old school. So here's the story I took that I heard about it, and that I put to the story path. So once upon a time, two young couples, the Birchmores and the McNultys, bought an old and abandoned schoolhouse. Every day, the two couples lived together in the house. The men worked at the mill and came home to work the small farm with their wives, until one day the couples decided to swap spouses, and one husband threw in a hog to even out the trade. And because of that, the men were put in jail. And because of that, the two women decided to take the hog and leave together, until finally the house was again abandoned and it fell into disrepair. And ever since, all that has remained is the old foundation. Now, this is a good story. It has an arc, it has characters, it has, anecdotes, it has a hog, it's got everything you need to tell a good story, right? But the problem here is, what if you don't have names and anecdotes to hang a story on? What do you do then? How do you tell a story that sticks if you don't have the benefit of this historic record? Here in the U.S., we divide archaeology between pre-contact, what we call prehistoric, sorry, and then historic. The idea being that up here in the Northeast, anything that dates after about 1600 can be seen as historic, because we've got a record. We have a written record about it. Somebody at work, a forester once, I was trying to explain this thing to him, and he was like, "But it's all the past. I don't see why you have to split things up like that. I mean, I don't get it." And I tried to explain it to him. He's like, "Yeah, but it's all in the past. I don't understand." But there is this idea that we don't have those names and the anecdotes and the dates and all that for pre-contact archaeology. So how do I construct a story about that past? So this here, to sort of to show how long this is, how vast this whole past is. And I know here I'm speaking to archaeologists, so this isn't, but I gave this talk at the NAI before. So so if you think that, like, the earliest evidence we have for people here in Vermont dates back about 12,000 or so years ago, at the end of the Ice Age. And so that is about 480 or so generations. If you assume that one generation equals 25 years, so historic is only about 15 or so generations. So that's almost 480 people going back through time. I mean, 480 generations. So that's a lot of names and stories and anecdotes and so on, that are out there. So how do you tell these stories that are going to stick with the audience? So as I think about this, I look at the work of a number of documentarians and so on, and I have like three approaches here to talk about. One is oral tradition. Another is the idea of the journey, and I have two categories within that. And then third, what I call the viewpoint. So to start with, oral tradition. So here I want to use an example. This is from Mount Ascutney State Park, which is in the eastern edge of the state in the town of Windsor. The Connecticut River is right along the eastern edge of the park, and so you have the mountain, and then as you come down the mountain, you've got this old glacial lake bed, as you see here on the right. It's just very well drained soils from the glacial lake bed, and so you have a lot of white pines there. And so the glacial lake was formed at the end of the Ice Age, as the glaciers, as they retreated, a big dam was formed in about 150 miles south of Mount Ascutney, with all of the debris and so on from the glacier. It formed this huge dam. It blocked up and made Glacial Lake Hitchcock. And finally, about 12,000 or so years ago, the dam burst and it drained the whole lake. Now that's not a story, okay? That is an explanation, but it's not a story. So how can I use something to like tell this about the glacial lake within the form of a story? So I go to the story of Glooscap and the giant beaver, which I learned from an Abenaki scholar, Marge Bruchak, and I take the story here and I put it within the Pixar story path. So if Pixar ever wanted to make a film about it, here's the story path. So once upon a time, the people fished along the river every day, feeding their families with a rich supply of fish, until one day a giant beaver built a dam that blocked up the river. And because of that, a great lake formed where once there flowed a river and the fish could no longer come up the river to spawn. Until finally, the people asked Glooscap to rid them of the beaver, and he severed its head. He broke down the dam and restored the river. And ever since, you can see the remains of the beaver at Beaver Mountain, Pecumtuck, with its giant severed head. And here's a picture of the mountain. It's just outside of Deerfield in Massachusetts. And you can see on the right is the head, and it's then been cut, and the body is there on the left. And the guy standing there is what the internet came up with when I typed in image for Glooscap. But anyway, so this right here, this story, it's got characters and it has an arc, with a dramatic resolution. So it has all these aspects of a story that might stick with the listener. And so so I can use this story as an entry point to teach glacial history, to teach the glacial history of Lake Hitchcock and so on. And the story can also be used as a way to talk about the antiquity of the indigenous presence on the landscape. So anyway, so that's one approach. Another approach here I wanted to talk about is the idea of the journey. In this case, the travel log. And to talk about this, I'm using an example here. This is Tony Robinson. I don't know if any of you have seen the show Time Team. He's hosted that for I think about 30 or so years now. Before that, he was in the show Black Adder from the early 80s. But anyways, he has this series called Ancient Tracks. And in this show, He takes about 3 or 4 days, and he hikes along some a trail or an old road or something in Britain, and he tells the story of his trips, and he ends almost every day in a pub, and it's always sunny, which is not my experience of Britain, but and anyway, so but it's a great series. And so what he does here is that he's telling a horizontal versus vertical history, and so it's almost as though like he reads the landscape as text, and it's the landscape that structures the story as opposed to the chronology. And he also talks about how as you walk the landscape, you learn how all these sites are connected. So what I did was I took this one episode where he walks for 3 or 4 days at Dartmoor National Park in Devon. And what I did is I took his tour and I made this chart here to show. Now he walks from left to right on this chart, and you can see how he's covering a time span going back to the pre Neolithic all the way up to the to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at the end of the 19th century. So he spans a huge amount of time, right? But he skips all over the place, so his story is not structured by time and by chronology, but by the actual by the landscape itself. And the ovals here are like myth, and I didn't know where exactly to put those, so I just put him in the middle here. But he tells these mythic stories that can then be tied to various time periods and so on. But he starts at an abbey that dates to the Middle Ages, and he ends up at a church that also dates to the Middle Ages. But he goes, he skips around and so on. So anyway, so here, as I said before, the landscape dictates the structure. All right. And for characters, we have Robinson and the trail, and his and the story of his interaction with the landscape. And in the course of it, we learn an awful lot about all these different times throughout the past. So then the other approach within the journey here is the idea of the actual journey of the archaeological process. And this here is a quote from a guy who wrote a book about storytelling. But the idea is that the story is in the journey itself. It's not in getting to the end. Like your conclusion, which you prove your thesis and so on like that. But rather the story is in the whole trip itself. In the journey. So here I have an example from another great British documentarian. I don't know what's in the water over there, but they make really good documentaries. I wish that we could, learn more from them. But anyway, so Michael Wood, he's been doing documentaries for like 45 years now or something. He now teaches public history in Manchester. But in this documentary that he made in '85, he tells the story of of Troy, but he doesn't take the approach where like he states his thesis, he finds his data, he does his analysis, and then he shows why or why not the mountain of historic is the place of ancient Troy. That's not how he structures it. Rather, he tells the story of all of the archaeologists who have worked there, and he goes through the story over the last 150 or so years, 30 or so years, going from one archaeologist to the next and telling how they interacted with what was happening in their lives at the time, what was happening in the world, and how they were expanding off of the work that had been done by those who came before them. And so by the end of the 6 episodes, you end up with like a really great telling, great understanding of the archaeology of the past of late Aegean, of late Bronze Age Aegean. So here, as I said, the archaeologists become the characters, and it's the journey of their discoveries that creates the dramatic arc, to the story. And he gave an interview in 2004 on the BBC in which he talked about making the Troy series, and he talks about this idea of a journey, and using the journey itself as a way to structure the documentary. So the final thing I wanted to talk about here in terms of how we might be able to structure stories is this idea of the viewpoint. And to explain this, I'm going back to England again. This is Lewis Castle in Sussex, and I went on a trip there when I was about 10 or so, and I remember hiking up here till I was in the keep there, and there was this old stone bench. It was really a very well-worn bench. I remember I sat down on that bench. The castle was built in the 11th century, and apparently in the 12th century there was a big battle that was fought there as part of the whole Civil War with Empress Maud and King Stephen and so on. I remember though I sat on that bench. I had this idea: if I really closed my eyes, I sat in just the right way, maybe when I opened my eyes, I'd be back at the end of the 10th, at the end of the 11th century. And luckily, that is not what happened. I opened up my eyes and it was still the 1980s. But the point of my story here is that, archaeology gives us this opportunity for a very tactile experience of the past. It's something that we can like touch, feel, smell, and so on, and that through that tactile experience, we can create this very excuse me, and empathetic connection with the past. Like me sitting on that bench. So in this sort of approach, it's the object itself that becomes the character in the story. In this case, the bench. Like who else sat on that bench? Who are all the people that might have sat on that bench? It was a very well-worn stone bench. So the object itself becomes the character in the story that we can tell about the past. Another example of this is the book by Janet Spector from the early 90s, which I read in graduate school. And I remember actually talking to Angela about this book. And I remember like talking to her and to my wife. And after 30 years, almost 30 years, I finally got it. All can mean two things. When I first had that book, I thought she meant, it's an all. Well, what does this all mean? But all can also, anyway, that's enough. But so, yeah, so in this book, Spector, she talks about this dig she does that she did in Minnesota, and she found this awl, and she uses the awl as a vehicle to talk about what it is, who were the women who might have used that awl, and what were their lives like, and so on. So here again, the object becomes the character through which we can then tell a story about the past. So, a key idea here is how can we spark the imagination in our audience, and so we can use something like the bench and all the people who might have used the bench or the awl and how the awl might have been used. So some dogs outside being very loud. But anyway, so Oh, and another way of seeing this too, I was thinking about, the ring, the one ring to rule them all. If you take that ring and you pass it through, and you tell the story of how it moved from all of these people, you end up with a story of Middle Earth at the end of the second age, or at the beginning of the third age. I have to ask my kids again, but anyway, so here again, we have this idea of the object. So in conclusion, uh, why is storytelling in archaeology important? So I talked about some of these ideas I have of how I might be able to be a more effective storyteller, but why is it important? Or why do I think it is important? So a couple of things. If we don't tell the stories, then who will? If we don't do it, then we create a vacuum. And who is going to fill the vacuum? Folks like this guy, Hancock. And I got through one episode of his show, but he had one of the most popular shows on Netflix. I guess it was like 3 or so years ago. I did watch one episode of it, but after that, I was like, I've done enough. I stopped. But then I watched a show. It was about a half hour long, and the show was titled "I watched all of Ancient Apocalypse, so you don't have to." I watched that one. But anyways, he's a good storyteller. It's all bunk, but he's very good at it. And so if we don't tell good stories, then folks like Graham Hancock are going to step into that vacuum. But and here I'm going to get back to the title of this talk, and that is this idea of stories as a palimpsest on the landscape. And so what is a palimpsest? Just that. Many of us, I'm sure, have heard the word, understand it. We've read Binford and so on. But for those of us who don't know, palimpsest goes back to those who study ancient documents, ancient books, and so on. So back before paper was first made, people wrote on parchment, and parchment is made from like sheepskin and so on. You stretch the sheepskin out, and I read somewhere that it can take about 300 or 400 sheep to make just one Bible. So parchment was worth a lot. It was a prized commodity. So what would often happen is that people would like scrape the ink off, from old text, and then they would reuse the same piece and write fresh text over the old text. So you see here, you've got two examples here where we have where you can see like the faint traces of the old text there, and then there's the new text on top. So what you end up with is this mishmash, all this text sort of written on top of each other. And in archaeology, here we have like a scatter of artifacts that might stretch back, thousands of years. It's all kind of meshed into together. You see also here like this idea. This is a profile view where you have these pit features that are all kind of meshed together. So we have archaeological palimpsest here. But I'm talking here about the idea of stories as a palimpsest on the landscape. So you've got all these, you got thousands of years of stories that are all sort of meshed there on the landscape itself. And so to explain this, I go back to when my kids were growing up. They're now 21 and 23, but we used to live outside of Albany, and each summer we would go on camping trips up in the Adirondacks, and camp and hike and paddle and fish and so on like that. And so, but then we haven't gone for a while, or at least not as much. But a couple of years ago, I was hiking again with Liam in the Adirondacks, and he told me, he said, all that time when I was hiking up and down all those mountains and so on, I had the soundtrack, The Last of the Mohicans, in in my head that that's what he told me when he was like, running up the mountain and so on. He was there with Uncas and Chingachgook and Hawkeye. And so, it was the power of that story, because those, Abe and Liam, they watched that film over and over and over again when they were kids. And so it was because of the power of that story that he understood that there were layers of stories across that landscape. He and Abe understood that there were centuries and thousands of years of people who had lived in those same valleys and mountains and so on. And it was, it was and it was because of that story. I want to contrast that with this thing right here. Standing Trees is an environmental organization based here in Vermont, and this here is cut from their website, and they say here, we are between two forested worlds: the natural forests of pre-settlement North America and the recovered forest of the future. So Abe and Liam understood what Mary Bird Davis and Standing Trees don't, which is that the land has never been empty. And in fact, there have been people here before there were trees here, so the land has never been empty. And Abe and Liam, as young boys, were able to understand that through the power of this story, right? So, but the last thing I wanted to talk about here, and now I mean honestly, this is the end. So this is the conclusion here, is that I gave this talk, and I was he invited to give a paper by the California Archaeological Site Stewardship Program at a session about community archaeology. And the paper I gave there was this idea about how stories can build and nourish our sense of community, And so this is back in March. I mean, I still think this. I mean, it's true. We use stories and we build connections with others through stories and so on. But this was back like 2.5 months ago, and which in present time feels like maybe 2.5 decades or something like that. So I'm not quite so optimistic or something in terms of what stories can do. Now I sort of see more like stories as resistance. Our country today is ruled by fear, arrogance, and ignorance. Or as we heard back in 2017, there's this fear that folks like me, white American men of European descent, that we are going to be replaced. And but I think it's important that we, and by we I mean historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and tribal historians and so on. I think that we have an opportunity to confront and to stoke these fears. We have an opportunity to tell stories that will, confront this fear. And I think that we have an opportunity to tell stories that will confront the exceptionalism that drives a lot of this fear of being replaced. And I think that if we can tell good stories, we can then express the depth of human existence and the richness of the human story, and ultimately that we are the ancient in the future modern. So anyways, I wanted to thank Beth and Chris Padden from the California Partners for Archaeological Site Stewardship, who he invited me to come give the paper from which this talk is derived from, and also to the VAS for the opportunity to speak here tonight. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And here I am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niels. That was fantastic. Very exciting. And you covered so much. And I feel like narrative and storytelling is so critical to what we do, for all the reasons that you discussed. And we can certainly get into it more. I did see a hand go up really quick. We can move on to the Q&A session now. Thomas, did you have a question for Niels?
I thought that was a clapping emoji.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it was. Do you have any questions though?
Not at this second.
Okay, well, I actually have one. So, I mean, we all sort of fall into this trap of talking a certain way. Do you have any tips, Niels, for, you know, approaching this? I mean, obviously your slide deck gives a lot of good examples, but any like quick tips for how to talk about archaeology in a more accessible way for people?
Yeah, that was actually something I was adding some slides about that, and then I was like, it's too long. So I cut those out. But yeah, it's sort of the idea, like, how do you actually talk the talk, you know? And I remember actually as a kid, as a teen, trying to imitate Michael Wood, you know, the guy I showed you with that Troy thing, because he has an excellent way of speaking, you know. But I think there are a couple of things. Yeah, there's one thing like Janet Spector talks about, like use the word I. You know, like we're all taught to write in you know, to write active as opposed to passive. You know, but she says also, like go a step beyond that and actually use the word I. You know, and which goes against the grain for everything that that we're taught in school, because we're supposed to be impartial and scientific and all that. But she's like, no, use the word I. And she has some good quotes about that I can't remember right now. But that approach, I mean, it shows it'll position you, and it also makes it more active, and it sort of, you know, shows how it'll place you within the whole process and such. So there's that. I also think, you know, in training to be an interpreter talks about this, but there's this idea of like aim small, miss small, which is what I was taught when I was taught how to shoot. You know, the idea is that if you aim for like the center of the target and you miss the center, you'll still hit the target, but just maybe a bit off from the center. Whereas if you try to just shoot the target and you miss, you'll completely miss the whole target. You know, so the idea is like, don't bite off as much. Just tell a smaller, simpler story. You know, I remember there's this priest that was a friend of our family's, and he used to talk about how you can always tell if a priest, when he's giving a homily, if he actually knows what he's talking about, because he won't go on for more than 5 or 10 minutes. If he starts going on for more than 10 minutes, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, so I think that, and actually, as part of the certified interpretive course, they had you, like, you had to give a whole sort of spiel within like 8 or 9 minutes or something like that, and which is not a lot of time, you know. So it really helps you to focus, you know. And so yeah, so there's those things. There's also the idea, like for instance, you know, like give very specific in ingredients. You know, like when I talked about what is a palimpsest, if I just said, oh, they use like sheepskins, you know, but I said, but no, they use, it takes 300 to 400 to make a Bible. Like that sticks, you know what I mean? So you take like those very specific things, and so that'll stick, you know. And then there's also there's a lot. I mean, there's actually, I was just staying, when I was in California, I stayed with a friend of mine who's a documentarian, and I was in his office. That's where he had me on a couch in his office. He had shelves of books all about how to tell stories, you know. So it's a whole literature. But I think, yeah, those idea, like use the word I, and you know, like aim for just a small amount, just bite off small amounts, and use very relatable anecdotes, you know, that people can like cling to, can kind of, you know, like that, I think, you know. And if you ask them, like I've learned a lot about this, you know, through being an interpreter. If you approach things by asking people stuff, you know, from their own lives, you know, to draw them in, that helps a lot as well. So.
Well, thank you. And I do have to say, like, you were talking about Time Team. I'm absolutely Professor Alice Roberts fan. So
Yeah, I don't tell my wife, but I've had a crush on her for many
I
years.
actually changed my vacation plans so I could see her in Gloucester.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. Yeah, I know. So.
Anyway, thank you.
Other questions for Thomas? Yes.
I remember a number of years ago, Giovanna Peebles was encouraging contract archaeologists to include little vignettes in reports that would you know, help explain or illustrate what was found in the ground.
Right.
I don't know. I know I did one for a site in Warren, a historic site. Was we found a deposit of bottles and a variety of artifacts at the corner of a house. And through the research, I found that at the time that the family was living in the house, the grandparents were living in an adjacent house. And so
Oh, did I lose? Am I lost, or did we lose Tom?
No, I've got you, Niels. I think Thomas just froze.
Oh no.
Oh, that's a drag.
Okay,
I
hopefully you'll
just
pop back
made
on.
up the
Oh, there he is.
family buried the deposit to protect, you know, to protect people.
Right.
So it's just a little imaginary story there to put it in context.
Yeah, I think I lost you there a bit. You froze, but I got the idea. Yeah, like that sort of thing. Like if you just tell it like a small anecdote, whatever, it'll stick with people. You know, it helps a lot like that. And I think also another thing I would say is that, like, you know, we as archaeologists, like we're addicted to time. You know, to chronologies, but that's not necessarily how stories work or how people think, you know. And I think that you lose the, you know, names and so on if you're so and I think that when we tell chronologies, we tend to create boundaries that don't actually, you know, that might not actually exist. Like we kind of like reify boundaries there that we use as heuristic devices, you know. Those are some of those big words I learned in graduate school that I like to throw out there. But yeah, I think it would be neat, Tom, you know, what you're talking about there, you know, to like, if we can like spin those sort of vignettes from what we find. And again, the whole idea of trying to inspire the imagination of us and of the listeners, you know.
Does anybody else have a question for Niels tonight?
Can I just make a comment?
Sure. Absolutely.
You know, the whole thing was, when I went to graduate school, which was in the early 90s, one thing they were complaining about was just so stories. And you know, how they wanted archaeology to be more scientific and less trying to tell you know, a fun story, because they're coming off of you know, the 1800s, where, you know, they wildly made up stories about what they had found. So what goes around comes around, doesn't it?
Well,
Hopefully,
I mean,
different.
sorry.
Hopefully in a slightly different form.
Yeah, I mean, one does not have to exist at the expense of the other, you know. I think that, you know, I mean, yeah, obviously being scientific is very important to the work that we do. And I would never, like I was saying when I had that slide about processes and so on, I like a good process. That's what really like turns me on, you know, in terms of archaeology and stuff, you know. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm just saying that if you want to be able to tell something that sticks with the audience, you know, if you want to be able to draw people in, you can't just use that, you know, like you have to be able to, you know, to create stories that will move beyond the scientific work and analyses and so on that you do, you know.
I don't disagree with you, Nails. It's
Oh
just,
yeah, no,
just
I know what you mean. Yeah.
it's just so funny because it was such a thing that the professors at UNM were like, especially a certain group of them, was just so like, you know, that was a real no-no.
Yeah. Well, they were probably also coming from like the new archaeology, you know, from the proceduralism of the 60s and 70s and so on, where you know science and math and so on was so important to the work that they were doing, you know.
I
Well,
think it's important to know your audience too, I would think, right?
Exactly.
Depends on who
Yeah.
you're talking
Yeah.
to, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go to a conference and tell a whole bunch of stories and so on. You know, I don't think that would work too well. So.
Lou Binford was the chairman right before I got there, so that'll tell you a little
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
where that comes from.
Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions for Niels?
Niels, this was really great. I was curious, you know, you outlined several different story forms, and I'm curious if you've been able to experiment enough to test out kind of which contexts match which forms best. You know, when, you know, you've given us a toolkit with some tools, when do we pull out the travelogue story? Have you gotten any pointers for that?
In terms of like from my own experience, yeah, I mean that would take a while to explain, I guess. I mean, I would try to say, well, I guess the short answer is yes and no. You know, so I mean, I have a lot of work I want to do. I never have necessarily the time to do it, you know. But like I've been thinking about, like, you know, we had this big project going on at Sandbar State Park, you know, and like so I've been sort of trying to think of ways. Like I remember I talked to somebody from VPR who called me up to ask about it and so on. And so like with that, you know, with like signage that you know that we you know we might produce from that. Like there are several ways in which I thought I might apply some of these ideas. Like we have lithics there, some from Lake Mistassini, you know, all the way up in Quebec. There's also Jasper, you know, Veracruz from Pennsylvania. And we have, you know, like a pot or a large, you know, pieces of a St. Lawrence Iroquois pot. So there you have a lot of journeying, you know. So to take like how did that church get all? I mean, the quartz site get all the way from Lake Mistassini, you know what I mean? So you have it and an opportunity to tell the story about these, you know, these you know, these stones that like made it all the way down here, you know. Or and so there's that sort of thing. You can also tell the story, you know, there's different people have different ideas about St. Lawrence Iroquois stuff, some of which is quite contentious, you know, so you can like pit those ideas against each other, you know, which is one of those approaches I talked about there, and then also like use that pot, that St. Lawrence Iroquois pot, as a way to talk about like how did it get here, you know, and how it might use that pot as a character, you know, sort of like with like the all thing, you know, with Janet Spector, you know. So those are some ideas. I would love to do. I have this sort of dream thing of like if you're to take like a paddle down like the Missisquoi or the Winooski, and you know, to do something like what Tony Robinson does, where you're talking about all the archaeological sites and so on as you go along, but it's not told in a chronological sense. But by the time you've gone from Cabot to the mouth, you know, you've spanned the whole, you know, 12,000 years, and you've told this whole story of it. And there are anecdotes about me getting in trouble on the river. I don't know, things of that sort as well. So that's another sort of idea I had about that, you know. And then I think also I would like to do something like the paper that you you know, that, you know, that you saw that I gave at the SAAs. That's now an article. If you all are interested, I can post it or whatever. But like with that, like, you know, take these two farmhouses at CC Putnam State Forest, and there to like structure that within the sense of like, you know, if you have a cellar hole in your backyard, how can you find out about it? You know what I mean? What's like the path for you to do your own research and to learn about this cellar hole, and you know, and then through the process of talking about that, you're talking about farming in the 19th century and the abandonment of hill farms, and you know, all this stuff. You know what I mean? So that's kind of process there. That's like the journey of the you know, the journey of the process of discovery, you know, so you can help people to take that journey on their own, and then in the process to talk about agricultural families at that time period. So I have, I guess, in the short answer would be I got a lot of ideas, but no time. So.
Great. Well, Niels, I feel like this is exciting. I feel like that we should all have this kind of course in graduate school, right? Or
Exactly.
to understand how to do this. I often feel like, you know, in our different fields, whether it's history or archaeology, you know, we're all trying to understand the past and tell these stories. In some ways, as Kathy mentioned, it's kind of frowned upon, right? You don't want to add too much room for speculation or anything like that, but it is important to tell the story. Otherwise, it's not going to connect with the person, right? And depending on the stakeholders in the community and who your audience is, we need to tell it in different ways. But I think it's a really important part of what we do, and why we need to do more of it. So.
Yeah, I learn a lot from being an interpreter, because you can then see how, like, if you just watch the faces of the people as you talk, and you can see them, like if they're like they start to play with things with their toes, you're like, oh, I got to do something quick here. This is not working out. So you just sort of like learn how to like change things. I mean, you've got the same basic spiel, you know what I mean, but you learn how to throw in things and to tweak things, whatever, to like work with the audience, you know, like that, you know, to like grab them and so on.
Very good. Are there any other questions for Niels this evening? Okay, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank Niels again for giving this fantastic talk. Thank you everyone for coming out and giving us your evening. And we hope that we see you all in the future. Remember, this presentation, we'll put this on our social media pages at a later time, so you can check it out again and share it. But thank you again, everyone. And thanks, Niels.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. Thanks a lot. Bye.